A solitary hunter living deep in the forest stumbles upon a hidden cave entrance in the forest, never imagining what was buried inside. What he discovers beyond that dark opening would change his life forever and rewrite his future. Subscribe for more powerful stories, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. The sun hadn't yet broken over the tree line when Mason Walker stepped out onto the frost-bitten porch, rifle slung across his shoulder like a memory too heavy to put down. The forest spread wide before him, quiet, endless, familiar. It had fed him, sheltered him, and taken from him, too, for more than 30 years. Mason had lived alone at the edge of Elk Ridge, surviving off the land like his father before him. Hunting wasn't just something he did, it was who he was. The rifle in his hand had more scars than stories he could tell. But the land had changed. The deer came less often now. The traps stayed empty. The old trails he used to follow had grown over with silence. The world moved on and left men like him behind, quiet, stubborn, and broke. Inside the cabin, the fire had gone cold, and on the kitchen table lay the final notice from the bank. 3 weeks, it said. After that, everything. The land, the cabin, the woods. He knew better than his own hands would be taken, sold off to people who saw no magic in trees or time. Still, Mason rose with the sun each morning, because men like him don't quit, not until the land takes them back. That night, the wind howled like something wounded. It swept through the trees and slammed against the cabin with a fury Mason hadn't felt in years. Rain came sideways, needles of cold pelting the windows until he thought the glass might break. He stoked the fire, pulled his old wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, and sat in silence, listening. There was something about a storm like that. It didn't just shake the roof. It stirred up the past. He thought of his father, who had hunted these woods long before him. Of the winter they lost everything but the rifle and each other. Of the spring his wife left and never came back. The wind didn't just rattle the house, it rattled the bones of memory. When he woke the next morning, everything was different. The trail he used for tracking deer, his only reliable path through the dense forest, was gone. Trees lay like fallen giants, limbs twisted and splintered, earth ripped open. Mud and rock had slid down the hillside during the storm, tearing the landscape he had known all his life into something wild and unfamiliar. But then he saw it. Past the fallen pine and cracked shale, tucked into the side of a ravine he'd never had reason to explore, was a dark opening just wide enough for a man to crouch through. It wasn't there before. Mason would have bet his life on it. The storm had unearthed something. He stepped closer, the wet ground sucking at his boots. Cold air poured from the gap like breath from a sleeping beast. It smelled ancient stone, damp moss, and something metallic beneath it all. Iron, maybe, or blood. He couldn't tell. A cave, hidden for God knows how long, and now laid bare at his feet like an unspoken secret. Mason stared into the darkness and felt a pull in his gut, not fear exactly, but something close to reverence, like standing at the edge of a grave or a church altar. He'd hunted these woods for decades, walked every ridge and trail, tracked elk through blizzards and drought. But this was something else. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, running his calloused fingers over the wood of his rifle. His body ached the way old bodies do, but his mind was sharp, too sharp. The image of that cave burned behind his eyes. He'd felt it deep down, like the land was calling him, not to hunt, not for food, but for something older, something forgotten. The next morning, he packed light lantern, rope, flask, pickaxe, and a notebook. Not because he expected treasure, but because the cave had already given him something he hadn't felt in years, a reason to move forward. The hike was harder this time. The storm had left the forest in pieces, but when he stood before the cave again, heart pounding like it used to on a hunt, he felt more alive than he had in months. He lit the lantern and ducked inside. The air changed instantly, cool and damp, muffling sound like a blanket. The ground sloped downward, slick with mud and stone. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic drops that echoed like a ticking clock. Mason moved slow, careful, breathing in the earth's breath. About 30 feet in it, the tunnel opened up into a narrow chamber, and there burnt into the stone was proof he wasn't the first. A circle of blackened rocks, the remnants of a campfire. Ash long dead, but still resting in place, like it had been waiting. He knelt beside it, running his fingers through the soot. Human. No doubt, not recent, but not ancient either. The marks on the walls tallies. Scratched deep into the stone told of someone who'd waited here. Counted days. Counted something. Mason swallowed hard. This was no animal den. Someone had lived here, hidden here, or maybe discovered something here. He didn't stay long. The cave was cold and unforgiving, and he had no way of knowing how deep it went. But as he stepped back into the fading daylight, Mason knew one thing for certain. He would come back, because in that dark, silent place, buried under years of earth and memory, he'd felt something he hadn't felt in far too long. Hope. Mason returned the next morning, earlier than before. The sky was a dull gray. Clouds heavy, but holding back the rain. He'd barely slept. His dreams were restless things, filled with flickering lights and whispered voices in the stone. But it wasn't fear that brought him back to the cave. It was that feeling again, that pull, like something down there was waiting for him, and had been for a very long time. He packed more this time: extra lantern oil, thicker rope, gloves, a small pry bar, and a flask of coffee. He didn't tell anyone in town what he was doing. He didn't have anyone to tell. No one came up this far into the woods anymore, not since the new highway bypassed the valley. This time, he went deeper. The passage narrowed, forcing him to crouch. The walls grew closer, the ceiling lower. His lantern flickered with every step, throwing strange shapes against the stone. Water trickled along the walls, whispering in a tongue he couldn't quite name. And the deeper he went, the colder it became, not just physically, but something deeper, like he was stepping out of time. After what felt like an hour, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber just high enough to stand in, just wide enough for the lantern's glow to reach the walls. And then he saw it. Half buried in the far corner, tucked beneath layers of stone and silt, was something that didn't belong: a timber beam, weathered and blackened at one end, like it had been scorched. Nearby, rusted pieces of what looked like rails curved into the darkness. Not natural, not accidental. Mason's breath caught in his throat. He dropped to his knees, brushing away dirt and debris. His fingers found iron rails nailed into the stone with bolts so old they crumbled at his touch. This had once been part of a mine, a forgotten one, abandoned so long ago that no one in town had ever mentioned it. Not in the stories, not even in the bar where old men traded ghost tales. And then came the real discovery. A few feet beyond the rails, Mason's lantern caught something else: a wooden crate, nearly rotted through, bound with rusted iron straps. He cleared the space around it slowly, cautiously, heart pounding in his ears. When he tried to lift the lid, it wouldn't budge. He grabbed the pry bar and wedged it under the edge. The wood groaned, then cracked. Dust spilled out first, choking the air, but beneath it, something glinted. Mason blinked. At first, he thought it was just metal tools. But when he brushed away the rest of the dirt, his fingers struck something smooth, solid, heavy. Gold. Coins, bars, stamped and worn, but unmistakable. His breath hitched, his knees buckled. For a moment, he thought he might be dreaming, but the weight of that gold in his palm, cold and unforgiving, told him otherwise. He sat back against the wall, lightheaded. The air around him seemed to hum. All these years, all the struggle, the debt, the hunger, the loneliness. And here, buried beneath the land he'd nearly lost, lay enough to change everything. Enough to save the cabin. Enough to start again. Enough to hope. But as the realization settled in, so did something else, a quiet dread. If he had found this, someone else could too. And someone had hidden it here for a reason. He scanned the chamber again. Slower this time. What else was in these walls? Who had built this tunnel? Who had been here last, and what had happened to them? Because gold like this, it didn't just vanish. It wasn't forgotten without reason. Mason closed the crate, heart still thudding in his chest. He didn't take it. Not yet. He didn't even touch the rest of the coins. He marked the spot with a small rock, blew out the lantern, and climbed out in silence. Back in the daylight, the forest felt different. Not safer, just older. Like it had been keeping this secret longer than he'd been alive. And now that he knew, nothing would ever be the same. Mason sat by the fire that night, the cave dirt still caked under his fingernails, the scent of damp stone lingering in his clothes. The cabin walls creaked with the cold, and outside, the forest had fallen into its usual hush. But something inside him wasn't quiet anymore. The crate full of gold was still down there. He hadn't taken a single coin. He'd found it, touched it even, but when the lantern light flickered across those heavy bars and dull coins, he felt something settle over him. Not fear exactly, not greed either. Something heavier. Like he'd stumbled into a story that wasn't his to claim. Not yet. He could have brought it back. Could have thrown it into a backpack and vanished from this cold cabin forever. No more scraping for ammo. No more boiled potatoes 5 nights in a row. No more counting quarters for a can of coffee at the general store. But Mason didn't move like that. He never had. And the more he sat with it, the more he understood something that didn't come from the gold. It came from the silence of the cave, from the black scorch marks on the walls, from the tally marks etched into stone. Someone had died down there, or tried not to. He wasn't sure which was worse. The next day, Mason walked the perimeter of the land around his cabin, not because he was looking for deer, but because he needed to think. The forest was his chapel. It always had been. Where others went to churches or bars or courtrooms, Mason went to trees, to silence, to tracks in the snow and the rustle of squirrels in the brush. He paused by a bend in the stream where his father once showed him how to skin a rabbit. That was 30 winters ago, maybe more. Funny how the memory stuck. His father had lived by one rule. Don't take more than you need, and don't leave less than you found. It was simple, and it was sacred. That's when it clicked. Maybe the gold wasn't a gift. Maybe it was a test. Mason returned to the cabin, pulled out a battered notebook, and began to draw his first sketch of the cave system. He marked where he'd found the rails, the broken crates, and the fire pit. He wrote down every symbol he could remember from the walls. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as he wrote, a strange energy took hold of him. Purpose. He hadn't felt it in a long time. The gold, yes, it was real. But there was more here. This wasn't just about saving himself from poverty. This wasn't just some old man clinging to luck. There was history buried beneath that rock, a story that had never been told. And maybe, just maybe, he was the one meant to tell it. He didn't know who built the mine. He didn't know why it was abandoned. But someone had sealed that place tight and left behind a fortune. Either they planned to come back and never did, or they wanted it hidden forever. Either way, Mason wasn't going to plunder it. He was going to understand it. So he made a plan. He'd document everything, keep records, dig carefully, stay quiet. The last thing he needed was half the county crawling into his woods with shovels and flashlights. He'd seen what money did to people, good men, too. He wasn't about to let a pile of gold turn his forest into a war zone. And deep down, he still believed the land had given him this chance for a reason. Not to escape his life, but to redeem it. That night, Mason sat outside on the cabin steps, wrapped in an old army blanket, watching the moon rise above the treetops. The wind whispered through the pines, the same way it always had. But now, every rustle felt like a reminder something was waiting for him beneath the ground. Not just treasure. A story, a reckoning, a chance to begin again. And this time, he wasn't walking away. It took Mason 3 days to return to the cave. Not because he was afraid, but because he needed time. Time to think, to breathe, to not let the gold speak louder than his instincts. He spent those days sharpening his tools, reinforcing his lantern, and stitching up his old pack where it had started to tear at the seams. The mountains weren't forgiving places, and whatever lay beneath them would be no different. But most of all, he spent time planning. He wasn't going down there to grab and run. That gold was older than anything he'd touched in years, and it wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't desperate anymore, not in the way he'd been. The hunger was still there, sure, the unpaid bills, the half-empty pantry. But something had shifted. The cave hadn't just offered him wealth. It had offered him a reason. So, on the 4th morning, Mason packed with care. Notebook, pickaxe, 2 coils of rope, extra matches, a flashlight, though he trusted his lantern more, and he added one more item, a weathered photograph of his father, folded and creased from years in his pocket. He didn't say anything out loud, but in his heart he whispered, "Come with me." He reached the cave just before noon. The entrance yawned open in the cliffside, exactly where he'd left it, like a mouth waiting to speak. He lit his lantern, tied the rope to a tree just outside the mouth, and stepped in with quiet determination. Inside, the air welcomed him like an old friend, cool, damp, still carrying the faint metallic tang of iron and time. He moved deeper, boots crunching softly on loose stone. His breath was steady, his hands firm. He knew where he was going now, back to the chamber where the gold had first revealed itself. The crate sat untouched, just as he'd left it. But this time, he came not just to observe, but to understand. He began taking detailed notes, measurements of the chamber, sketches of the rail lines, a careful inventory of what lay inside the crate, not to take, but to document: bars, coins, a few loose artifacts, rusted tools, a broken lamp, a torn scrap of fabric that looked like it had once been part of a mining uniform. He gently pulled a ledger book from beneath the coins. The pages were stuck together. The ink faded, but some dates and figures remained legible. Payments, shipments, names. It wasn't just gold, this had been an operation. Legitimate, systematic. But then, suddenly, the entries stopped. No signature, no final note, just a blank page, like someone had closed the book mid-sentence and never returned. Mason ran a gloved hand down the paper. It gave him chills. He kept searching. In a side passage, partially collapsed, he found more wooden support beams, rusted lantern hooks, even a rusted tin cup. Men had lived down here, worked here, maybe died here. He felt like an intruder, but also, somehow, like a steward, a protector of something long forgotten. When he finally emerged from the cave that evening, sun bleeding through the trees, Mason didn't feel the weight of gold on his back. He felt the weight of responsibility. He didn't want to hoard it. He didn't want to sell it to the highest bidder. What he wanted was to preserve it, tell its story, honor the men who'd built it, who'd lost it. He knew he couldn't do it alone. So he made his way into town again, not to talk about gold, but to ask quiet questions at the county clerk's office about old mines, abandoned claims, forgotten deeds. The woman behind the desk raised an eyebrow, but said little. She handed him a few ledgers, yellowed, brittle, but intact. Back in his cabin, Mason pored over every page by lantern light, and there it was. Ridge Creek Mining Co., registered in 1908. Operations halted in 1931. No bankruptcy filed, no closure notice. Just silence, which meant one thing. The land was still unclaimed. He set the papers down, heart pounding, not with greed, but with something better. A chance to protect it, to file the right paperwork, to restore what had been left behind not for money, but for memory. And maybe, just maybe, for meaning. The snow came early that year. It dusted the pines like powdered sugar, soft and silent, muting the world around Mason's cabin until it felt like he was the only man left on Earth. And maybe he was, or maybe he'd just stopped needing anyone to notice him. Because for the first time in years, he had work to do. Not the kind of work that drained your soul for pennies, but work that meant something. Each morning, Mason rose before the sun, brewed coffee strong enough to peel paint, and packed his gear. The cold didn't bother him like it used to, not when he knew the cave was waiting. That darkness below no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a calling. He started reinforcing parts of the tunnel quietly, carefully, nothing invasive, just enough to keep things safe. He replaced broken lantern hooks, propped up sagging beams with new braces cut from dead pine, brought in small shovels and hand tools, everything discreet. He wasn't mining. He was restoring, documenting, preserving. Down in the lower chambers, where time had collapsed the old passageways, he discovered more artifacts. A brass belt buckle with initials carved into the back, a rusted harmonica, even a folded letter sealed in wax still intact after all those years. He didn't open it right away. Something told him to wait. Up in the cabin, he built a second journal, one for the history of the mine, page after page of notes, sketches, dates, names. Sometimes he'd stop and just stare at the pages, realizing he was becoming the keeper of a past no one else even remembered existed. The solitude didn't haunt him anymore. It grounded him. He ate better, slept deeper, spoke less, not out of habit, but out of peace. The silence became a companion, not a punishment. And somewhere in that silence, Mason began to change. He stood straighter, walked stronger. The weight that had once bent his back, the weight of years, regret, debts, loneliness, it had been replaced by purpose, not just in his spine, but in his eyes. One afternoon, he walked into town with snow on his boots and dust in his beard. Folks hardly recognized him. His gait was confident now, shoulders squared, eyes focused. Not proud, but rooted, like a man who'd come out the other side of something most people never escape. At the post office, he quietly filed paperwork, a formal claim for the old Ridge Creek mine, backed by dates, photos, artifacts, and maps. No fanfare, no boasting, just facts, truths backed by sweat and patience. The clerk asked him if he planned to reopen it. Mason simply said, "I plan to honor it." Back home. He spent evenings sitting by the fire, sometimes reading old mining records by lamplight, sometimes just watching the flames dance and thinking about the men who'd once built those tunnels. Men like his father, gritty, unspoken, hard-edged and full of quiet hope. He understood them now more than ever. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Mason finally opened the wax-sealed letter he'd found deep in the mine. The handwriting was shaky, faded, but legible. "To whoever finds this, we couldn't carry it all. The mountain was angry. We left what we could not take. If you find it, do better than we did. Remember us, don't let it be for nothing." Mason sat there for a long time after reading it. No words, just a tear he didn't wipe away, because now he knew this wasn't just gold. It was a legacy, and it had chosen him not to spend it, but to guard it. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the journal. Later that week, he began planning something he never imagined he'd do: write a letter to the County Historical Society. Not to alert the press, not to stake a claim for fame, but to ask for guidance, how to preserve a site, how to record history properly, how to keep something sacred without letting the world destroy it. Mason Walker had once been just a hunter in the woods, but now he was a storyteller, a guardian, a man with something worth passing on, and that was more valuable than all the gold in the world. Spring arrived like a whisper that year. The snow melted slowly, revealing patches of pine needles and cold earth. Tiny green shoots poked their heads through the ground, and the forest exhaled after its long, frozen silence. But it wasn't just the woods that were waking up. Mason Walker was changing too. The man who had once stared at his own empty pantry and counted the days until the world forgot him was now a man with a path, a voice, and perhaps most surprisingly, a future. The cabin had not been rebuilt, not in the way some might imagine. The roof still creaked when the wind blew hard, and the door still stuck when it swelled with rain, but inside it was warmer now. Not just from the fire, but from what lived in the space between the walls' purpose. He had built shelves, lined them with journals, artifacts, even the sealed letter that had nearly broken his heart. A small wooden chest sat in the corner, filled not with gold, but with history. Mason didn't need riches to feel wealthy anymore. What he had was meaning. The mine remained untouched, save for the quiet work he did reinforcing walls, cataloging old routes, brushing away time with a gentleness that surprised even himself. And slowly, word began to trickle out, not of treasure, but of discovery. It wasn't him who told. It was the Historical Society, replying to his carefully written letter. They sent a representative, an older man with glasses too big for his face and hands that shook when he touched the rail lines in the cave. "This is extraordinary," he whispered. Mason simply nodded. The man asked him if he wanted to go public, to make it official, to open it to researchers or preservation grants. Mason thought about it long and hard. "I want to do it right," he said, "but I don't want to see it destroyed." So they worked out a plan, quiet, respectful, controlled. Mason would retain access and stewardship. The society would help record and preserve. No media, no tourists, just slow, deliberate honoring of the past, just the way he wanted it. He wasn't looking to be remembered. He just didn't want the ones who came before to be forgotten. That spring, for the first time in decades, Mason invited someone up to the cabin. It was a young park ranger, Sarah, who had heard rumors about the preservation work and asked to see it firsthand. She arrived cautious, unsure, but respectful. And when she stood inside the cave, tracing her fingers along the tally marks carved by some lost soul almost a century ago, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. They were real, she said. People lived here, died here, and we almost lost it. Mason didn't reply. He just placed a steady hand on her shoulder and nodded. He knew exactly how that felt. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the last light fade through the trees. The birds sang like they hadn't in years. The breeze smelled like moss and thawing bark. Sarah asked him what he planned to do next. Mason thought for a long time before answering. "I think I'll keep listening," he said. "To the land." He smiled. "To the past. It's still speaking. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." She left the next morning, promising to return with materials, contacts, and maybe a recorder for oral history. Mason said she could bring all that if she wanted, so long as she brought the same respect she had carried in her eyes. As the days stretched longer and warmer, Mason fell into a rhythm he had never known before, not survival, not desperation, but peace. He still hunted now and then, still walked the ridges, still mended the cabin as best he could, but the man who once measured life by empty cupboards and overdue bills now measured it by legacy. And one morning, standing at the edge of the ravine, he looked back at that cave no longer a secret wound in the earth, but a living doorway between what was and what still could be. He removed his hat, ran a hand through his graying hair, and whispered not to anyone in particular, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Because the truth was simple. He hadn't just found gold in that cave. He'd found himself. Mason Walker thought his story was over, thought the world had turned its back on him. But in the cold silence of the forest, he found something unexpected, not just gold, but a voice from the past asking to be remembered. The lesson isn't about treasure. It's not about luck. It's about listening. To the wind through the trees, to the creak in the floorboards, to the weight of what we carry, and the echo of those who came before. You don't have to be rich to be redeemed. You don't need an audience to live with purpose. Sometimes, the greatest transformation happens far from the eyes of the world, in a cave, in the woods, in the quiet heart of a man who simply chose not to give up. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe. More true, powerful journeys are on the way. And if you know someone who believes in second chances, share this with them. Sometimes, one hidden door is all it takes to change everything.